On May 16, 2026, USS Gerald R. Ford sailed through the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay and turned toward home. 5,000 sailors stood in dress whites along the edges of the flight deck, a tradition the Navy calls manning the rails. On the pier at Naval Station Norfolk, their families had been waiting, some of them for almost a year. What those families didn't fully know, standing in the Virginia morning sun, was what those 5,000 people had actually been through. 326 days at sea. That is not a typo. 326 days. More than 10.5 months. The longest deployment of a United States aircraft carrier in over 50 years. And before Ford came home, it had crossed 3 oceans, fought in a real war, survived a fire that burned for 30 hours, and logged more flight launches than any carrier in recent memory. This is the story of what that deployment actually cost, in money, in machines, and in the people who carried it. To understand what 326 days means, you first need to understand what a carrier deployment is supposed to look like. The standard U.S. Navy carrier deployment runs roughly 6 to 7 months. The ship leaves its home port, operates in a designated theater, conducts exercises and presence missions, and returns. The crew gets shore leave. The ship goes into maintenance. Everything resets. Ford's deployment was supposed to follow that pattern. It left Naval Station Norfolk on June 24, 2025. The mission, a scheduled rotation to European waters. Standard, routine, expected to end by early 2026. But between June 2025 and May 2026, nothing went according to plan. And by the time Ford came home, it had pushed the limits of what the Navy officially believed its carriers and their crews could endure. To understand how that happened, you have to understand what Ford was actually carrying and what it was designed to do. USS Gerald R. Ford is not just an aircraft carrier. It is the first of an entirely new class of warship, the most technologically advanced surface vessel ever built by any nation. Its most visible innovation is a system called EMALS, the Electromagnetic Aircraft Launch System. For decades, carriers used steam catapults to hurl aircraft off the flight deck. Steam catapults work, but they are mechanical, temperamental, and wear out aircraft airframes over time because the force they apply is not precisely controllable. EMALS uses a linear induction motor, essentially a giant railgun for aircraft, to accelerate planes from 0 to flying speed in approximately 2 seconds. The system applies a controlled, progressive force that can be tuned precisely for each aircraft type, from a lightweight drone to a fully loaded F/A-18. That means less structural stress on airframes, longer aircraft service lives, and, critically for sustained combat operations, higher sortie rates. Ford is also equipped with the advanced arresting gear, a new system replacing the hydraulic arresting cables that have existed on carriers since World War II. The old cables worked on a simple principle of brute hydraulic resistance. The new system uses a controlled rotary energy absorber that can catch aircraft of vastly different weights without risking a cable snap or gear failure. These two systems together, EMALS and AAG, are why Ford exists. They are what make it capable of launching the next generation of heavier, more capable aircraft, including the F-35C and whatever comes after it. But in 2026, during the highest intensity sustained combat operations Ford had ever seen, those systems were being tested in ways the Navy had not fully anticipated. On February 28, 2026, at 1:15 Eastern Time, the United States launched Operation Epic Fury, a sustained military campaign against Iran. Ford was already in the Eastern Mediterranean. Within hours of the operation's launch, its flight deck was running at maximum tempo. Strike Fighter Squadron 37, the Bulls, launched F divided by a -18E Super Hornets in back-to-back cycles. Strike Fighter Squadron 213, the Black Lions, and Strike Fighter Squadron 31, the Tomcatters, were cycling through maintenance and launch windows around the clock. The EA-18G Growlers of Electronic Attack Squadron 130, the Zappers, flew ahead of every strike package, jamming Iranian radar systems so the strike aircraft could operate without being tracked. To sustain this, the ship runs what is called a flight schedule, a tightly choreographed sequence of launches, recoveries, maintenance, rearming, and refueling that repeats every 90 minutes or so during high-tempo operations. Every person on the flight deck has an assigned position. Every aircraft has a sequence number. A mistake in that sequence, a misread signal, a moment of distraction, a tool left on the deck, can disable an aircraft or kill a person. During Epic Fury, Ford's flight deck ran that cycle for days on end. By the time the deployment was over, Carrier Air Wing 8 had logged more than 5,760 flight hours and 12,200 flight launches. To put that in context, a commercial airline like Delta operates roughly 5,000 flights per day across its entire global network. Ford's Air Wing, operating from a single ship, came within striking distance of that number, over nearly 11 months. But operations at that scale require something most people never think about: fuel, food, ammunition, and spare parts. A lot of them. And the only way to get them to a carrier at sea is one of the most demanding logistics operations in modern warfare. USS Gerald R. Ford has a crew of approximately 4,500 sailors and officers, plus roughly 2,500 more in its embarked air wing. That is nearly 7,000 people living on a vessel that is roughly 1,100 feet long, about the length of 3.5 football fields. Those 7,000 people eat, sleep, work 12-hour shifts, and in 2026, fought a war, all within the same steel hull. They consume tens of thousands of meals a day. They burn through jet fuel, spare parts, lubricants, medical supplies, and enough laundry to require an industrial-scale washing operation running around the clock. To sustain all of that, Ford conducted 23 replenishments at sea, unrep operations, during the deployment. A replenishment at sea is exactly what it sounds like. Two ships sailing parallel to each other, separated by perhaps 150 feet of open ocean, at speeds of around 12 to 15 knots, connected by rigging lines carrying fuel hoses, cargo nets, and transfer rigs. The operation can last several hours. It requires precision ship handling, experienced line crews, and weather conditions that cooperate, none of which are guaranteed in a combat theater. 23 times, Ford's crew executed this operation, across the Atlantic, in the Mediterranean, in the Red Sea. But even 23 underway replenishments could not prevent what happened on March 12, 2026. At 1:15 on the morning of March 12th, a fire broke out in the aft laundry facility of USS Gerald R. Ford. Fires on warships are among the most feared emergencies in naval operations. A carrier hull is a maze of passageways, fuel lines, ammunition magazines, and electrical systems. A fire that reaches the wrong compartment can cascade catastrophically. Ford's damage control teams responded immediately. What followed was more than 30 hours of continuous firefighting, a sustained effort by hundreds of sailors working in shifts to contain and extinguish a fire that moved through ventilation systems into adjacent compartments. The fire was non-combat. Nobody was killed. 2 sailors received treatment for minor injuries. But the damage to the ship's interior was significant. More than 600 sailors lost their sleeping quarters. Over 100 racks, individual beds, were destroyed. The Navy's solution: strip 1,000 mattresses from the future USS John F. Kennedy, still sitting unfinished in a shipyard in Newport News, Virginia, and fly them to a carrier operating in an active war zone. Ford left the Red Sea for Suda Bay, Crete, for emergency repairs, then moved to Split, Croatia, for a port call that gave the crew 5 days of shore leave, their first in months, while the ship was patched back together. Then it went back to the Red Sea. As of early April, Ford had been at sea for more than 280 days. It had already broken every post-Vietnam War carrier deployment record, and the question the Navy was quietly asking was, how much further can we push this? Ford returned to Norfolk on May 16, 2026. The deployment officially clocked in at 326 days, exceeding the previous post-Vietnam record by more than 30 days. The numbers from the deployment are extraordinary. 57,713 nautical miles sailed, 23 replenishments at sea, 12,200 flight launches, 3 operational theaters, 1 war. But the numbers that matter most aren't in the press release. The Navy is now facing a maintenance bill for a $13.3 billion warship that spent 11 months operating at the limits of its design tempo. The fire investigation is still ongoing. The full scope of wear on MLs, the advanced arresting gear, the nuclear propulsion plant, and the airframes of every aircraft aboard is still being assessed. The record deployment of USS Gerald R. Ford didn't happen because the Navy wanted to set records. It happened because the United States, in 2026, needed 3 carrier strike groups operating simultaneously, and Ford was one of only a handful of ships capable of filling that role. The U.S. Navy has 11 aircraft carriers. At any given moment, 4 or more are in some form of planned maintenance or overhaul. The rest are either preparing to deploy, recovering from deployment, or actually deployed. Ford's 326-day marathon reveals something the Navy does not say publicly, but the numbers make clear. The margin between American carrier capacity and American carrier commitments has become dangerously thin. The $22.3 billion the Navy has committed for the Ford-class program over the next 5 years is not just an investment in more powerful ships. It is an acknowledgement that what just happened to Ford, and to the 7,000 people who lived inside it for almost a year, cannot become the new normal. Whether it already has is the question nobody in Washington has fully answered. Ford is home, but the Navy's problem didn't come home with it. Because while Ford was being stretched beyond its planned limits, something else was happening on the other side of the world. China watched 3 American carrier strike groups deploy to the Middle East simultaneously, and began quietly calculating what that commitment cost and how long it could be sustained. Next week on Naval Air Dispatch, we're going to look at what China has been building in direct response to American carrier operations, and why the Navy considers it the most serious threat to carrier aviation since the introduction of the guided missile. If the story of USS Gerald R. Ford was something you didn't know before today, subscribe. Every week we go inside the ships, the aircraft, and the decisions that define modern naval power. That video drops next Thursday. Don't miss it.